All right, today we're jumping into something pretty controversial. It's a seduction guide called The Tension Method. Now, this thing markets itself as a super raw, no-fluff answer to modern dating. So in this explainer, we're just going to break down what it's all about, looking directly at what the source material says.
Right from the jump, the author makes one thing crystal clear. He says he's not here to talk about inner game. He's basically rejecting all that mainstream self-help stuff you hear about, working on yourself. This really sets the stage for a guide that is all about tactics, nothing else.
So, just to be clear, our goal here is just to lay out what this method is, exactly as it's presented in the text. We're going to look at its core ideas, the actual steps it recommends, and the kind of worldview it pushes, all straight from the author's own words.
Okay, so what is the tension method? Well, the author doesn't just present it as, a bunch of techniques. He frames it as the solution to what he sees as a huge problem for guys in today's dating scene.
And it's interesting, he actually starts by telling you what the method is not. He's super explicit. This is not about self-help, it's not about emotional inner game, and it's not a guide to becoming some perfectly well-rounded man. The focus here is laser sharp and totally tactical.
And this quote right here, this really gets to the heart of the problem he claims he's solving. His whole argument is that the big-name dating advice industry is just a business. It's designed to sell you stuff, not give you what he thinks are effective strategies. And that's his whole justification for this more direct, unfiltered approach.
And boom, there it is. The author's own definition of his method, and you gotta pay attention to the words he uses. They're super deliberate. Ignite primal sexual desires, see you as a sex object, and in the shortest time possible. Yeah, this is not about building some deep romantic connection. The stated goal is to trigger a very specific, very sexual response, and to do it fast.
All right, now let's dig into the philosophy behind all this. This is where we get into the central and, probably the most controversial idea of the whole thing, this concept of programming desire.
So the author kicks this whole section off with a big question. It's really meant to make you think, to challenge the usual ideas we have about attraction and chemistry. And his answer to that question? It's a hard yes. This is the absolute foundation of his entire system, this belief that attraction isn't some magical, fixed thing. He's saying it can be actively created, almost manufactured, through a specific process, even if she had zero interest in you to begin with.
The central metaphor he uses over and over is that people can be programmed, kind of like a computer. So in his world, seduction isn't about chemistry or fate. Nope, it's a form of psychological programming where you use specific inputs to get a very specific desired output.
And this quote right here, it builds on that philosophy. The author makes a really sharp distinction between what a woman might say she wants, her conscious preferences, and what he calls her subconscious primal urges, what she truly desires. The whole method is designed to just bypass the first thing to hit the second one directly.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal of the method. According to the author, a woman sees a man in one of two ways, either as a sex object for desire or a utility object for resources. This method is designed for one thing and one thing only, to make sure you land in that first category.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how does it actually work in practice? Well, the author really hones in on two main environments, the street and the club.
But before we get into that, there's a key term we absolutely have to understand. It's a piece of jargon the author uses called buying temperature. Basically, this is his term for how open or receptive a woman is when you first approach her. A high buying temperature means she's interested. A low one means she's not. And this idea is absolutely crucial to his whole strategy.
So how you apply the method completely changes depending on where you are. On the street, he says the pace has to be slower. You use conversation to build comfort before any physical touch. But in a club, where it's loud and fast, he says you go for immediate physical escalation.
And this quote, well, it shows you his completely raw, unfiltered take on the club scene. He's basically arguing that no matter what women say, the real reason for being in a club is sexual. And because of that, a guy should act accordingly. Be direct, be physical, right away.
So you might be asking, why even bother with the street if it's so much harder? Well, the author's view is that mastering the method on the street, which he literally calls playing this shit on hard mode, builds such a high level of skill that every other environment, like a club, just becomes incredibly easy in comparison.
All right, now we're getting into the real nuts and bolts of the method. The author lays out this very specific step-by-step process for building tension that he calls the escalation ladder.
And to get the ladder, we need to know one more key term, keynote. It's short for kinesthetics, which is just a fancy word for physical touch. But in this system, Kino isn't just a casual tap on the arm. It is the primary tool you use to escalate things.
So let's break this ladder down. The author lays out a really clear 4-step process. Step 1 is all about basic touches. Hand on the shoulder, lower back, just to establish some comfort. If that goes well, he says, you move to the second round, which is a bit more intimate. Then the third and fourth rounds get way more explicitly sexual, with the goal being to seriously escalate the physical interaction. The whole thing is presented as this very systematic, very calculated progression.
This quote really pulls back the curtain on a core belief driving this whole thing. The man must always be the one leading. According to the author, if a woman has to take charge of the seduction, it's a total failure on the man's part. He frames the whole interaction as like a test of your masculinity.
Okay, so after all the theory, the tactics, the escalation ladders, what's the end game? This last section looks at the results of the method and let's just say, the broader, often controversial worldview that the author pushes. So, according to the author, to really master this method, you have to buy into a very specific way of seeing the world. This includes believing that real relationships only start after sex, that a woman who truly desires you won't make you wait, and that mainstream society is basically against men who are successful with women. He even goes so far as to warn that this kind of success will actually make people hate you.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought here. This method, it's presented as the super direct, almost aggressive solution to what the author sees as a problem in modern dating. So we'll just leave you with this question. No matter what you think about the method itself, what does the fact that it even exists and has an audience suggest about the state of modern dating today?